right, Ryan Reynolds here for Mint Mobile. Are you looking for a beach read this summer? May I suggest your big wireless bill? It's got suspense, mystery, a slightly flat emotional arc, and a shocking twist where you realize you've been overpaying the entire time. Fortunately, though, Mint's story is better. Every plan, $15 a month, even unlimited. That's it. Happy ending, 0 tears. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3 months, $90 for 6 months, or $180 for 12-month plan required. $15 per month equivalent. Taxes and fees extra. Initial plan term only. Greater than 50 gigabytes may slow when network is busy. See terms.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I discuss true crime cases involving military members and veterans. And I do this with one goal in mind, to remind you to remain vigilant always. Today, I am picking right up where we left off last week, chatting about Sedrick Cobb, a suspected murderer and rapist. I recommend going back to listen to part 1 first before continuing here. I do have a trigger warning for everyone. Of course, all of my cases involve murder, but today's case also involves rape. With that in mind, please listen with care. Join me today as I bring you the conclusion of Julia Ashe's case. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
So I want to pick up telling you a little bit about Sedrick Cobb. In 1961, Sedrick Cobb's mother was only about a month pregnant with him when she was thrown from a capsized boat while holding her 18-month-old son, Daryl. Tragically, Daryl drowned, and family members later described Cobb's mother as depressed and emotionally withdrawn after the loss. And when Sedrick was born on February 3, 1962, he was said to cry almost constantly. In 1967, when Cobb was about 5 years old, the family relocated from Arkansas to Naugatuck, Connecticut. He graduated from Naugatuck High School in 1980, where he lettered in track and earned decent grades before enlisting in the Army in 1982 as a transportation specialist. At some point during his enlistment, he was stationed in Mannheim, Germany. And it was while he was stationed in Germany that Cobb met his wife, Petra. They married and they had a son together. However, things in the military didn't work out for him. In 1987, as an E4 after 5 years of military service, rather than face a court-martial after sexually assaulting a woman at knife point, Cobb accepted an administrative discharge under other than honorable conditions. After his discharge, Cobb returned to Connecticut, where he worked as a delivery driver for a local hospital and later for a plumbing supply company. We'll get back to his time in Germany and his wife a little bit later, but for now, let's return to what happened after his arrest. The crime against Julia happened in December of 1989. We are now in mid-January 1990, and Cobb pled not guilty to the sexual assault of the woman he had attacked at the Naugatuck Industrial Park on December 13th. He was scheduled to return to court on January 29th for proceedings related to that case, as well as a separate probable cause hearing in Julia Ashe's murder case. Now, under Connecticut law at the time, anyone charged with a crime punishable by death or life imprisonment was entitled to a probable cause hearing unless they chose to waive it. The purpose of the hearing wasn't to determine guilt or innocence. Instead, the judge had to decide whether the prosecution presented enough evidence to justify sending the case to trial. Now, this probable cause hearing lasted 2 days, with State's Attorney John Connolly presenting the prosecution's evidence. Among the exhibits were the glove that had been forced into Julia's mouth and secured with tape, as well as a tire from her car that Cobb had deflated, changed, and then placed in the trunk. Crime scene specialist James McDonald testified about recovering Julia's body from the frozen ground, explaining that investigators had to chop through the surrounding ice before they could remove her remains. He also demonstrated that the valve stem on the tire found in Julia's trunk had been deliberately loosened. Prosecutors further connected that evidence by introducing the valve stem cap that investigators had recovered during the search of Cobb's car. Detective O'Leary also testified about the verbal confession that Cobb gave to him and Lieutenant Dealey following his arrest on December 27th. During cross-examination, Assistant Public Defender Alan McWhitter questioned why Cobb had never signed the written version of that confession. O'Leary explained that investigators first prepared a written statement and then reviewed it with the suspect page by page before asking them to initial each page and sign it. Well, according to O'Leary, that process was interrupted when defense attorneys arrived, so Cobb never had the opportunity to review or sign the written statement. At the conclusion of the probable cause hearing, Superior Court Judge Maxwell Hyman ruled that prosecutors had presented sufficient evidence to move forward with the case. Cobb was ordered to stand trial on charges that included kidnapping, first-degree sexual assault, and capital felony murder. He entered a plea of not guilty and initially requested a jury trial. Months later, Cobb waived his right to a jury and elected to be tried before a 3-judge panel instead. Before accepting that decision, the court carefully questioned Cobb to ensure that he understood the consequences. Cobb repeatedly confirmed that no one had threatened or pressured him, and he even told the court, quote, "No, I do it of my own free will," end quote. The judges also explained that if the panel found him guilty, those same judges would have to agree to preside over the penalty phase. If any one of the judges declined, a jury would be assembled and they would determine the sentence. At one point, one of Cobb's attorneys interrupted to tell the court, like, hey, we've already explained this to our client. But the judges, they were like, no, we want to make sure that we tell Cobb this directly and he needs to respond directly to us. Before trial began, Cobb's attorneys attempted to suppress key evidence, arguing that his confession, along with evidence seized from his car and apartment, had been obtained illegally. The court disagreed. The evidence showed that Cobb had been advised of his Miranda rights throughout the investigation. He had signed a written consent allowing detectives to search his apartment, and that once investigators discovered evidence linking him to another crime, they stopped their warrantless search and obtained a search warrant before collecting additional evidence. Cobb's capital murder trial began on May 29, 1991. He was facing 2 capital felony charges: murder committed during the course of a first-degree sexual assault and murder committed during the course of a kidnapping, both of which carried the possibility of a death sentence. Standing before Superior Court judges Joanne Kolowitz, John Lagenbach, and Gerald Barnett, Cobb again pled not guilty. One of the prosecution's first witnesses was Julia Ashe's fiancé, John DeSantis. He testified that the last time he saw Julia alive was on the afternoon of December 16th when she left to finish her Christmas shopping. The next time he saw her was at the medical examiner's office, where he was forced to identify her body. John also testified that he had recently cashed Julia's paycheck and given her approximately $300 in cash inside a credit union envelope. He remembered that when she left home that afternoon, her car had 4 properly inflated tires. Because investigators had recovered seminal fluid from Julia's body, the defense suggested that those fluids could have belonged to John rather than Cobb. John testified that the last time he and Julia had sexual intercourse was on the night of December 14th, roughly 2 days before she disappeared. During a very aggressive cross-examination, defense attorney Alan McWhitter repeatedly questioned whether the semen could have been John's. Clearly frustrated, John responded, "You want details?" before again insisting that December 14th was the last time they had been intimate. At the time of Julia's murder, DNA testing was still relatively new, and this case became the first in Connecticut to feature DNA evidence generated by the state forensic laboratory. Prosecutors argued that the testing excluded John DeSantis as the source of the semen and instead identified Sedrick Cobb. Over the next 8 days, State Attorney John Connolly presented the prosecution's case. They called 35 witnesses and introduced more than 100 pieces of evidence. Among those witnesses were Bonita Casertano and Susan Romello, who testified about separate encounters at Bradley's shopping center. Both women described discovering flat tires on their vehicles before Sedrick Cobb came bobbing along and offered to install their spare tires, evidence that the prosecution used to establish a pattern in Cobb's behavior. When it was the defense's turn, attorney Alan McWhitter called no witnesses, introduced no evidence, and Cobb chose not to testify, which is his right. Instead, the defense focused on raising reasonable doubt during closing arguments. Defense attorney McWhitter argued that prosecutors had failed to prove Cobb intentionally caused Julia Ashe's death. He suggested that the glove forced into Julia's mouth may have caused her to suffocate before her body went over the dam, telling the court, quote, "There are many questions left to be answered, including whether Julia Ashe was alive when she went over the dam. And if she wasn't alive when she went over the dam, the crime of intentional murder is not the crime for which Mr. Cobb can be found guilty," end quote. He closed by asking, quote, "Who caused the death of Julia Ashe? I'll leave that to the court. As to why, I'll have to leave that to God," end quote. State's Attorney Connolly forcefully rejected that argument during his rebuttal. He told the judges that the answers were found not only in the physical evidence and photographs from the crime scene, but in Cobb's own confession. Connolly argued, quote, "Why? Because Julia Ashe was a nice kid. Why? Because of greed, because of opportunity, because of lust, and because some people in society, and Mr. Cobb is one of them, are mean, vicious, rotten people. He preyed on that girl. He wanted to pay his rent. He took her Christmas presents and cashed them in," end quote. Throughout the trial, Julia's parents, Thomas and Jeanette Ashe, and her mom went by Jan, along with her sister Lorraine, attended every day of the proceedings. Sitting directly across the courtroom from them were Cobb's parents, Raymond and Lottie. After hearing 8 days of testimony, the 3-judge panel deliberated just 4 hours before returning a unanimous verdict. Sedrick Cobb was found guilty on every count. The penalty phase was scheduled to begin on July 16, 1991, before the same 3 judges who had convicted Cobb. At the time, another capital murder trial was unfolding elsewhere in Connecticut before a jury. If these 3 judges sentenced Cobb to death, it would mark the first time in Connecticut history that a 3-judge panel had imposed a death sentence. During the penalty phase, the prosecution had to prove at least one statutory aggravating factor that justified a death sentence. Connolly argued that Julia's murder was especially cruel, heinous, and depraved. The defense, meanwhile, they sought to convince the court that mitigating evidence, particularly Cobb's background and character, warranted mercy and a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead of death. Before testimony began, defense attorneys Gerald Smith and Alan McWhitter asked the judges to clarify the legal definition of, quote, especially cruel, quote, heinous, quote, depraved. Smith argued that the manner of Julia's death was central to the case, telling the court, quote, there is a factual issue whether she was dead or alive when she was pushed off the dam. We do not have notice as to what we are called upon to defend against, end quote. After a brief recess, the judges returned with definitions drawn from Connecticut and U.S. Supreme Court decisions. They explained that a murder is especially cruel when it involves the intentional infliction of extreme pain or suffering beyond that inherent in the killing itself. A murder is especially depraved when the killer demonstrates indifference to the victim's suffering or derives satisfaction from the crime. They further noted that courts have consistently defined heinous as conduct that is hateful or shockingly evil. With those legal standards established, the penalty phase got underway. It was expected to last 3 days, but it would ultimately take much longer. The prosecution began by reconstructing Julia Ashe's final moments. Connolly argued that Cobb had gained Julia's trust by pretending to help her with a flat tire before sexually assaulting her, binding her with duct tape, and pushing her nearly 23 feet off the dam into the icy water below. According to the state's theory, Julia survived the fall and desperately fought to free herself before ultimately succumbing to her injuries. The deputy chief medical examiner testified that Julia likely cut herself on the exposed wire while trying to free her hands. He also explained that she appeared to have scraped at the duct tape covering her mouth in an attempt to remove the glove that had been forced inside, tearing off one of her fingernails during the struggle. To support that theory, prosecutors introduced Julia's tennis shoe recovered by divers along with her torn, mud-covered jeans and coat. They also presented pieces of duct tape recovered from the wire at the pond, which contained red fibers consistent with Julia's coat. The defense challenged the admissibility and relevance of much of that evidence. When McWhitter objected to the introduction of Julia's jeans, Connolly responded passionately, arguing that the physical evidence corroborated Cobb's own confession. He told the court, quote, Miss Ashe was alive at the bottom of the dam. Cobb said in his own confession she was alive when he pushed her off. She was at the bottom of the dam, struggling for her life, crawling on her hands and knees, end quote. One piece of evidence the defense successfully kept out, though, was a letter that Cobb had written to a former classmate named John Gallagher, and he wrote this letter while he was awaiting trial. Prosecutors argued that the letter demonstrated Cobb's consciousness of guilt and his willingness to manipulate others. In it, Cobb claimed that police had planted evidence and that his confession was false. He also asked Gallagher to provide a false alibi, writing, quote, "I understand that I'm asking a lot, but my life is at stake," end quote. He then instructed Gallagher to destroy the letter after reading it and even enclosed a receipt from a candy store at the Naugatuck Valley Mall, hoping that Gallagher would use it to support a fabricated story placing Cobb at the mall at the same time that Julia was murdered. The judges reviewed the letter in chambers before ruling it inadmissible because it was irrelevant. And immediately after they ruled inadmissible, the defense attorney asked for a mistrial, saying that the judges had been exposed to the highly prejudicial letter and could no longer render a fair and impartial sentence. The judges denied the motion. The following day, the defense began presenting its mitigation case, starting with Cobb's parents, Lottie and Raymond. Known to family and friends as Ricky, Cobb was described as a normal child and an average student. Raymond testified they had always been especially close to his son, while Lottie admitted that she had felt closer to her other 4 kids. She described Ricky as someone who constantly wanted to joke and clown. Neither parent believed that Cobb had needed counseling as a child, and Raymond testified that his son had never abused drugs or alcohol. Still, one of the most emotional moments of the hearing came when Lottie told the court, quote, "If I could trade my life for Julia's, I would," end quote. Cobb's parents also testified about his marriage to Petra. They claimed that she persuaded him to return to the United States after his discharge from the Army, and she persuaded him by promising that she was going to follow him later with their young son. According to Raymond, that promise was never genuine, and once Cobb realized that Petra was never coming to the United States, he became withdrawn and isolated himself from the rest of the family. The defense also played a 10-minute home video showing Cobb interacting affectionately with his son. On the third day of testimony, the defense called psychologist Dr. Ann Phillips. She testified that Cobb suffered from chronic low self-esteem and an intense fear of rejection that made it difficult for him to form healthy, intimate relationships. She described him as someone who was not without emotion, but who carried a persistent undercurrent of anger that occasionally erupted into rage. As she explained, quote, "It takes a great deal of energy for Mr. Cobb to keep his emotions in check and stay on an even keel," end quote. Dr. Phillips further testified that Cobb suffered from a mixed personality disorder with schizoid and paranoid traits and opined that his mental condition substantially impaired his ability to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law when he kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered Julia Ashe. She even suggested that Cobb should have been receiving psychiatric treatment rather than out roaming parking lots targeting women. During cross-examination, State's Attorney John Connolly asked Dr. Phillips whether she believed there was ever an appropriate use for the death penalty. And despite testifying on Cobb's behalf, she answered, quote, "I think there's a place for the death penalty. I think the death penalty is appropriate in cases that are particularly heinous or particularly cruel," end quote. Okay, real talk for a second. How do you and your family operate on a daily basis? Are you like me before Skylight, with a pretty planner stuffed with birthday invitations shoved into the wrong month or random thoughts scrawled all over it? Yeah, that used to be me until I got my very own digital Skylight calendar. And thank goodness, because with 3 daughters, work, school pickup, tutoring, activities, and dental appointments, my brain was basically fried. That's why the Skylight calendar has honestly been such a game changer in our house. It's this beautiful 15-inch digital smart calendar that syncs with Google Calendar, Apple Calendar, Outlook, everything. And it puts the entire family schedule all in one place. So now my kids can actually walk by and see what's happening for the day. My oldest knows when track practice is, my middle child knows when homework is due, and my youngest even checks her routines in the morning. And the reason why Skylight is so good is because families are better when they're working together. And guess what? Right now, Skylight is offering my listeners $30 off their 15-inch calendars by going to myskylight.com/MMP. Visit myskylight.com/MMP today for $30 off your 15-inch calendar. That is myskylight.com/MMP. The defense ultimately called 27 witnesses. Among them were Cobb's younger sister Gail and his older brother Byron, who was an ordained Baptist minister. Byron testified that their parents had a loving relationship with Ricky and that he had never been treated differently or disciplined more harshly than the other children. Petra did not testify in person, but instead she appeared through a recorded deposition. She initially described the early years of her marriage to Cobb as happy, saying, quote, "They were perfect. We understood each other. We loved each other. We'd do things together. He'd be kind, friendly, just perfect," end quote. She testified, however, that everything changed after Cobb was discharged from the Army following the sexual assault. According to Petra, Cobb became convinced that no one loved him, including her, and he began physically abusing her. She testified that after Cobb struck her in front of their young son in October of '88, she gave him money for a plane ticket back to the U.S. and asked him to leave their apartment. She ended her testimony by saying she still intended to send photographs of their son to Cobb in prison because she wanted their son to know who his father was. The defense also presented testimony from former teachers, coaches, coworkers, and supervisors, many of whom described Cobb as respectful, dependable, and even a valued employee. Several witnesses noted that his personality seemed to change in the months before Julia's murder, and that he had abruptly quit his job just days before beginning his attacks in December. Correctional officers from the jail also testified, describing Cobb as a general, cooperative inmate with a strong work ethic. At the same time, they did acknowledge that he had received disciplinary reports for possessing contraband and for fighting. They also explained that inmates charged with sexual offenses frequently become targets of violence within the jail, and Cobb himself had been assaulted several times. Despite that, some of the inmates housed with him wrote letters asking the court to spare his life. Finally, the defense introduced military court records documenting Cobb's accomplishments during his Army service, including certificates of achievement and a Good Conduct Medal, as further evidence that they believed weighed in favor of a life sentence rather than death. Prosecutor John Connolly was prepared with his own rebuttal witnesses. One of them was an Army chief warrant officer who testified about Cobb's military service, explaining that after sexually assaulting a woman in Mannheim, Germany, Cobb was given the choice of facing a court-martial or accepting an administrative discharge under other than honorable conditions. The prosecution also introduced portions of Cobb's military personnel file, including letters of reprimand for assaultive behavior and provoking gestures. Detective O'Leary also returned to the stand to describe an encounter with Cobb in May of 1991, while Cobb was being transported to an evidentiary hearing. As Cobb passed O'Leary in the courthouse hallway, he looked at the detective and said, quote, "You'll pay for this later," end quote. Sheriff's deputies witnessed the exchange. The state also asked the court to allow Julia's sister, Lorraine Ashe, to deliver a victim impact statement. Although victim impact testimony was permitted in many Connecticut murder cases, the law at the time did not authorize it during the penalty phase of a capital trial. Connolly argued that a recent Tennessee decision supported admitting the testimony, but the judges disagreed, concluding that Connecticut's capital sentencing statute differed too significantly from Tennessee's to justify doing so. Now, I do want to point out that that distinction mattered in this case because Connecticut's death penalty statute required the court to impose a life sentence if it found even a single mitigating factor. After the judges excluded Lorraine's testimony, Connolly told reporters he wanted the court to hear how Julia's murder had devastated her family. Quote, "After hearing all that stuff about the defendant's backgrounds," he said, "I thought it was important for the judges to refocus on the victim and the impact the crime had on her family," end quote. Throughout the trial, Julia's parents largely avoided speaking with the media. On one occasion, however, Jan Ashe quietly explained her silence by saying, quote, "This is Julia's story," end quote. Lottie Cobb took a different approach. She told reporters that Jan Ashe was, quote, "praying for us and praying for Ricky. They are good Christian people," end quote. And as it turned out, the two families already knew each other. Years earlier, at a Christmas party in 1979, the Cobbs and the Ashes had spent part of the evening sitting together, talking about their children. During the trial, Lottie Cobb and Jan Ashe occasionally exchanged brief smiles and a few quiet words despite the unimaginable circumstances that had brought them together. What was expected to be a 3-day penalty hearing ultimately stretched to 11 days. On August 12, 1991, both sides delivered their sentencing arguments. Defense attorney Gerald Smith urged the judges to spare Cobb's life, arguing, quote, "Clearly there are two Ricky Cobbs. There is a good Ricky and a bad Ricky. You cannot execute one without destroying the other. I submit it's a fair compromise in this case to incarcerate him for the balance of his natural life, to allow the good Ricky to live," end quote. The state argued that Cobb was not mentally disturbed, but manipulative. He praised Cobb's parents for the lives they had tried to build for their children, telling the court, quote, "What more could a mother and father do for their kids than what Mr. and Mrs. Cobbs did for their kids? They broke their butts to raise good kids," end quote. The state reminded the judges about that Christmas sweater that Julia had purchased for her father shortly before she was murdered, a gift that never reached him because it instead became an exhibit in the courtroom. Connolly closed by arguing, quote, "To show mercy to Sedrick Cobb after what he attempted to do to this court would be an injustice," end quote. Referring to Cobb's attempt to manufacture a false alibi, the judges deliberated for approximately 8 hours over the next 2 days before returning with a decision. As I mentioned, under Connecticut law, the existence of even one mitigating factor would have required the court to sentence Cobb to life imprisonment rather than murder. The judges concluded, though, that there were 0 mitigating factors in this case. They further found that Julia's murder was especially cruel, heinous, and depraved, describing the crime as hateful and shockingly evil. In announcing their decision, the panel wrote, quote, "The evidence supports the determination that the victim experienced extreme psychological and physical pain and suffering throughout this entire episode," end quote. With that, Sedrick Cobb learned his sentence. He was condemned to life on Connecticut's death row. In October of 1991, prosecutors decided not to move forward with the sexual assault and burglary charges stemming from Cobb's attack on the Oxford woman. Because Cobb had already been sentenced to death, the state just concluded that transporting him back and forth for another trial created an unnecessary security risk. Before making that decision, though, prosecutors consulted the victim, who agreed. That same month, Julia Ashe's family filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the owners of the Bradley's shopping center. They were alleging that inadequate security in the parking lot contributed to her abduction and murder. I was unable to determine how that case ultimately was resolved. Over the next decade, Cobb filed a series of appeals challenging both his conviction and his death sentence. Among other arguments, his attorneys claimed police had violated his constitutional rights during the investigation. They challenged the legality of the searches. They argued the evidence did not support a death sentence, and they asserted that Connecticut's death penalty was applied in a racially discriminatory manner. In 1994, while appearing in court for one of those proceedings, Cobb attacked his own public defender, a guy named Kent Dragger. Although Cobb was wearing leg restraints, his hands were free. Sheriff's deputies quickly subdued him, and Dragger was fortunately not injured. Many of Cobb's appeals focus on allegations that Connecticut's death penalty was imposed unfairly, particularly against Black defendants. Although several Connecticut Supreme Court justices expressed concern that the issue deserved, maybe a little further examination, the courts ultimately rejected Cobb's claims and upheld both the conviction and the death sentence. His final direct appeal reached the United States Supreme Court in the year 2000. The court declined to hear the case, leaving his death sentence intact. But then, as happens in most of these cases, everything changed. You see, in 2012, Connecticut abolished the death penalty. However, the repeal applied only to future cases, meaning that the 11 inmates already on death row, including Mr. Cobb, remained under sentences of death. That changed 3 years later, in 2015, when the Connecticut Supreme Court ruled that executing those remaining death row inmates would violate the state constitution. As a result, every remaining death sentence in Connecticut was overturned. With that, in 2016, Cobb was formally resentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, he remains incarcerated at Garner Correctional Institution, where he will spend the rest of his life. Now, before I end, I want to talk about Julia. Julia Ashe was born on February 15, 1967 in Waterbury, Connecticut, and she was one of 4 kids. Her family had already endured unimaginable heartbreak by the time of her death. You see, 7 years earlier in 1982, Julia's older brother Daniel was killed in a hit-and-run crash, and he was just 25 years old. Julia graduated from Holy Cross High School in 85 before attending the University of Connecticut, where she studied graphic design. Just weeks before she was murdered, she completed a graphic arts internship with Aetna Insurance and was offered a full-time freelance position with a raise. Her professors remembered her as a gifted artist whose work included posters, illustrations, jewelry, and paintings. Julia and her fiancé, John DeSantis, had been together for 5 years, and they were planning their wedding. Instead, John found himself identifying Julia's body and 2 weeks later attending her funeral. A funeral mass was held on December 30th, 1989 at Immaculate Conception Church in Waterbury before she was laid to rest at New Pine Grove Cemetery. The following February, faculty members at UConn honored Julia by displaying her artwork in a 2-week memorial exhibit at the Fine Arts Building. The collection included posters, drawings, and a self-portrait that she had created as a freshman. Julia's professors described her art as an outlet for self-expression and hoped the exhibit would bring comfort to her family and friends. Julia was survived by her parents, Thomas and Jan Ashe, her brother, Timothy, and her sister, Lorraine, who was also studying art at UConn at the time of Julia's death. Thomas, her dad, passed away in 2017, and Jan, her mom, followed in 2022. In 1990, 2 funds were established in Julia's memory. One helped purchase computer equipment for graphic arts students at UConn's Storrs campus, while the other recognized outstanding art students at the Waterbury campus. More than 3 decades later, Julia's legacy continues. Each year, a scholarship bearing her name is awarded to a graduating high school senior, with preference given to students pursuing careers in the arts. Now, I just think that it's amazing that even in death, even more than 35 years later, Julia's talent, her kindness, and love of art continue to open doors for young artists who never had the chance to meet her. I think that's a beautiful legacy. True Crime Army, thank you so much for joining me today for the conclusion of Julia's story. Again, thank you to my listener who recommended it to me, and shout out to Myrtle for researching and writing this episode. Now, don't forget to come back next week where I will have a brand new case for you. My sources for today's case include various appellate court documents, articles in the Hartford Courant, the Record Journal, the Connecticut Post, the Burlington Free Press, Connecticut State Department of Corrections website, and Ancestry.com. Military Murder is a Mama Margot production. The music was created by Tyops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next time.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.